He was a sculptor whose hands breathed life into stone. She was an influencer who saw the world through a screen and loved the power those hands gave her. He used those same hands to pull her from a fire and lost them forever. In return for his sacrifice, she erased him from her life, like an imperfect photo. But art has a memory, and this is the story of how the truth, carved in the silence of pain, became a revenge the entire world would watch, live. The air in the art gallery was a razor blade of smoke and ash, slicing through the lungs with every desperate breath. The alarm was a maddening siren, a continuous shriek of panic. Leo pushed through the chaos, the heat warping the air in front of him, his scream a raw, hoarse thread, barely cutting through the roar of the fire. Savannah! Then he saw her, trapped. A steel beam from the ceiling structure, twisted and glowing an incandescent orange, had pinned her against the wall. Her expensive dress was scorched, her face coated in soot, her eyes wide with pure terror. There wasn't a moment of hesitation. Pure instinct, a desperate love took over. He threw himself at the beam, feeling the white-hot metal devour his hands with an unimaginable ferocity, the sound of his own skin sizzling. The pain was a universe of agony exploding in his mind. With a final roar that tore from the depths of his soul, he moved the metal. She was free. And that's when his strength vanished, and the blinding, deafening white world of pain swallowed him whole. To understand the man who charged into the flames, you had to know the artist who lived in the dust. Before the smoke and the agony, Leo Vance's world was a sanctuary of quiet focus, broken only by the steady rhythm of his hammer against chisel. His studio, an old warehouse at the end of a forgotten street, was his entire universe. Sunlight streamed through a high skylight, casting golden shafts into the air thick with marble dust, revealing a ballet of floating particles. There, among raw blocks of stone, awaiting a purpose and unfinished sculptures that seemed to struggle for freedom from the material, Leo felt complete. The son of a carpenter who taught him the value of manual work, he saw a story in every rock. His hands, thick and calloused, weren't just tools. They were translators for his soul, capable of finding softness and movement in the hardest, most unyielding material. He was a man of few words because his true language was texture, form, and weight. Then, Savannah Cole entered his life. She was the antithesis of his world, a hurricane of flashbulbs, notifications, and smiles perfectly crafted for a phone camera. A digital influencer who measured life in engagement and beauty in filters. At first, the attraction was magnetic. She saw in him fascinating content, the rustic artist, the authentic figure who would lend depth to her feed. He, in turn, was blinded by her vibrant energy, believing their universes could merge. But the cracks soon appeared. She would invade his sacred silence with live streams, asking him to smile for the camera while he attempted a delicate cut. "Babe, look over here, the lighting is perfect," she'd say, turning his intimate process into a performance. He would yield, stop what he was doing, force a smile. He saw them as small sacrifices, gestures of love. He didn't realize that for her, his studio wasn't a temple but a backdrop. His art wasn't his soul but an accessory, and he, the artist, was just the main character in a story that wasn't his own, and he endured it all in silence for one reason. Because while Savannah was casting him as a character in her digital narrative, Leo was building them a future in a place she didn't even know existed, his imagination. Leo's deepest desire had nothing to do with critical acclaim or the market value of his work. The dream that drove him, the force that guided his weary hands at the end of each day, was to sculpt a home, not just a house, but a refuge, a livable work of art that would be the physical, undeniable testament to his love. For him, it would be his ultimate masterpiece. In his studio, tucked inside a thick oak tube that had belonged to his father, he kept the blueprints. They weren't cold, technical drawings, but scrolls of yellowed parchment paper, filled with charcoal sketches, notes, and dreams. He would spend hours at night hunched over them, designing every detail with the same devotion he gave a sculpture. The house would be divided into two wings, two souls connected by a beating heart. On one side, his sanctuary, a studio with a monumental ceiling height and floor-to-ceiling industrial windows facing north, guaranteeing the soft, constant light he cherished. The floor would be polished concrete, forever dusted with his work, and the walls of raw, honest, exposed brick, a space of strength, silence, and raw creation. On the other side, her world, an impeccably white studio with a minimalist design, soundproofed walls, and a smart lighting system that could replicate any time of day with the touch of a button. It would be a digital laboratory, an aseptic, perfect space designed for creating immaculate images, free from the interference of dust or the chaos of the real world. And connecting the two, a vast living room. An entire wall would be glass, looking out onto a wild garden where Leo's sculptures would rest among trees and flowers. In the center of the room, a stone fireplace he would carve himself, the fire symbolizing the passion that united their two universes. It would be there, in that meeting space, that enduring art and ephemeral content would join hands, proving to the world they could coexist. This dream wasn't just a drawing, it had a beginning. Tucked away in a velvet box, far from Savannah's eyes, was the cornerstone, a small plaque of Appalachian blue marble, a rare and absurdly expensive stone he had bought with the money from his first major sale years ago. It was smooth, cool to the touch, its blue veins like a map of celestial rivers. Every night before sleeping, Leo would hold it, feeling its weight, imagining it set in the foundation of that house, the heart from which everything would grow. Every sacrifice he made was for this. Every forced smile for a selfie, every expensive dinner that drained his bank account, every time he swallowed his pride when she criticized his work. It was all an invisible brick being added to the structure of that dream. He imagined showing her the blueprints, not on some ordinary day, but in a moment of pure emotion. He pictured the tears in her eyes, not the influencer's tears, but Savannah's, as she finally understood the magnitude of his love, the depth of his devotion. He believed that, faced with this proof of love carved in plans and dreams, she would finally see beyond the surface. He had no idea he was designing a palace for a queen who only cared about the appearance of the gates and who never had any intention of living inside. But the chasm between the future Leo was secretly designing and the reality he lived with Savannah grew deeper by the day, a geologic fault ready to swallow everything. Her criticisms, once veiled, were now direct, armed with the cold logic of the market. One afternoon, she walked into the studio, not with a camera, but with a tablet in hand, swiping through images of popular sculptures on interior design websites. They were polished, abstract, inoffensive pieces made to match a sofa. "Look at this, Leo," she said, in the tone of someone presenting an obvious solution. "It's clean, it's pretty, it's marketable. People want to decorate their homes, not have an existential crisis in their living room. Think of it as a business. Our business." Each word struck Leo like a physical blow. He looked at the soulless, anonymous figures on the screen and then at his own work in progress, a marble figure contorted in an expression of struggle and yearning. His truth was there, exposed. "Savannah, for me, art, it's what's left after the truth is told. It's not an object," he tried to explain, his voice low. She sighed, a sound heavy with impatience. "Truth doesn't pay the bills, babe. Truth doesn't get us out of this place. Don't you think about our future?" She used the word "our" like a weapon, aimed precisely at the dream he nurtured, not knowing the target was his own heart. The pressure peaked as the gallery opening approached. For Savannah, that event wasn't about art, it was about relevance. It was a chance to solidify her status as a tastemaker, to elevate herself from an influencer to a power player in the cultural scene. And Leo's centerpiece was the anchor of her entire strategy. She began visiting daily, her evaluative gaze sweeping over the sculpture, her mouth ready to fire off suggestions. It's so dark, don't you think? The lines are too aggressive. People like things that are peaceful. It needs to be something they want to take a picture of, something grammable. He felt like a hired craftsman, an executor of orders. The primal joy of creation, the silent dialogue between him and the stone, had been replaced by a suffocating anxiety. The marble seemed to resist his touch. The chisel felt heavy in his hand. He was betraying himself with every hammer strike, and the sound echoed in his chest like a judgment. The night before the opening, the final argument erupted. The sculpture was finished. It was a powerful, undeniably honest work, but it wasn't what she wanted. Savannah stood before the piece, arms crossed, the mask of her professional smile completely gone. "This is it?" she said, her voice icy. "After everything I did, getting this opportunity for us, you give me this suffering thing. This isn't going to inspire anyone to buy anything, Leo. This is going to scare off the sponsors." The pain finally broke through Leo's dam of patience. "This is me, Savannah. This is the truth. It's the only thing I know how to do. When are you going to see what's right in front of you?" he yelled, the sound echoing through the empty warehouse. She took a step back, her face hardening, and delivered the final sentence. "Then you better be a massive success tomorrow, because I've staked my name, my contacts, and my future on this night. Don't expect me to keep betting on someone who isn't willing to risk the same for me." The air grew heavy, still. She turned and walked out, leaving him alone with his creation, which now seemed like a monument to his own loneliness. That was the real fire, the first flame, the one that consumed everything inside, long before the actual fire arrived. The first sound was a beep, rhythmic, impersonal. The first smell, a sharp antiseptic that burned his nose. When Leo opened his eyes, the first sight was a white ceiling, smooth, infinite. The pain came next, a slow, pulsing wave rising through his arms. He was in a hospital. The memory of the fire, her scream, the glowing metal, returned in violent flashes, but it felt like a movie watched by someone else. Reality was here, in this sterile room. He tried to move, to sit up, and that's when panic hit him with the force of a freight train. His hands didn't respond. Where his fingers, his calluses, the tools of his existence should have been, there were only two formless bundles of pristine white gauze and bandages resting inert on the sheet. They were alien objects, protrusions that didn't belong to him. A silent scream formed in his throat. He couldn't feel his fingers, couldn't feel his skin, couldn't feel anything but a dull ache and the terrifying certainty that a fundamental part of him had been amputated forever. Savannah appeared hours later. She didn't run in, didn't cry. She entered with measured steps, wearing white linen pants and a silk blouse, her hair in a perfect bun, her makeup flawless. She looked like she was coming from a business meeting, not the ICU. "Leo, babe," she whispered, stopping at a safe distance from the bed. "You scared me." The phrase hung in the air, self-centered, absurd. He looked at her, the confusion and pain in his eyes searching her for a safe harbor. An answer. "My hands," he managed to say, his voice raspy and weak. She winced, a quick spasm of discomfort. "The doctors did what they could. You were so brave. Everyone is saying so." Everyone who, he thought. She didn't touch him, just walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "It was all so fast, such a trauma. I need some time to process it. It was awful." She was talking about herself, her trauma, her scare. He watched her, and for the first time, he saw her with terrifying clarity. She wasn't there with him. She was just playing a role, visiting an unpleasant obligation before getting back to her life. After 10 minutes of empty phrases, she was gone, leaving behind her expensive perfume and an even deeper silence. It was a nurse who, with the best of intentions, brought him his phone the next day. "To help you distract yourself a little," she said with a smile. With immense difficulty, using the knuckles of his less bandaged hand, Leo managed to unlock the device. His phantom thumb yearned to swipe across the screen. The first place he went, by pure instinct, was her page. He needed to see her, to feel some connection, and that's where the real humiliation began. At the top of the feed was a new post. It was a professional photo of her sitting in a cafe, looking pensive, a single artistic tear rolling down her perfectly made-up face. And the caption was a masterpiece of cruelty. "To my incredible community," it began. "As you know, the last few days have been a blur of smoke and fear. I went through the most terrifying experience of my life, a true trial by fire that forced me to reevaluate everything. Sometimes the universe sends us drastic signs to remind us of what truly matters, our own strength, our ability to be reborn from the ashes. The scars I carry now aren't on my skin, but in my soul, and they've taught me about the impermanence of everything. I'm grateful to be here, to be able to breathe, to have a second chance. I want to thank every one of you for the thousands of messages of support and love. You are my rock. This healing journey will be long and solitary, and I've decided I need to walk it focused on myself, on my emotional recovery and my well-being. It's time to be strong for myself. Thank you for understanding. With love and resilience, Savannah." Leo read it once, twice, 3 times. The air wouldn't enter his lungs. He scrolled to the comments. There were thousands. "You're a warrior, Savannah. Stay strong, Queen. Your resilience inspires us all. We're with you, a true phoenix." There was not a single mention of him. His name didn't exist. His sacrifice didn't exist. In the narrative she sold to the world, he had been completely erased. He wasn't the hero of her story. He wasn't even a supporting character. He was less than an extra. He was the rubble left behind by the fire, an inconvenient part of the story swept under the rug so as not to stain the beautiful picture of the survivor. The pain in his arms vanished, replaced by an icy void that consumed him completely. This was it then, annihilation. He hadn't just lost his hand, he had lost his place in the world, his existence in the memory of the only person for whom he had sacrificed everything. In that moment, in the sterile white room, Leo felt like a ghost, and the final blow came when the same nurse entered, smiling. "I saw your fiancée's post. What a strong and inspiring woman she is, isn't she? You two are such an example of courage." The phrase, uttered with genuine admiration, was the final nail in the coffin of his dignity. He just closed his eyes, and the white world of the room became an infinite pit of darkness. The darkness that swallowed Leo in that hospital room didn't last for an instant. It became his new address, a permanent residence built of silence and indifference. The days that followed were a long, monotonous plateau of nothing. Nurses came and went with their artificially cheerful voices, changing his dressings, taking his blood pressure, talking about the weather outside. He barely registered their presence. Food arrived on plastic trays, always fragrant and hot, and grew cold, untouched, beside his bed. He ate the bare minimum to stay alive, but his hunger was of a different kind. A hunger nothing there could satisfy. He stopped speaking, responding to the world with monosyllables, or more often with a vague nod. Communication became too great an effort. What was there to say? How could he put into words the feeling of being a phantom in his own life? The worst torture, however, came from within, from a place the doctors couldn't reach. It was the phantom pains. He would feel, with maddening clarity, an itch on a finger that was no longer there. He'd feel the familiar weight of a chisel in a palm that was now a mound of scar tissue under bandages. At night, he dreamed he was sculpting, and would wake with the muscles in his arms tensed, his phantom hands clenched in frustration, trying to grasp tools he would never hold again. It was his own body betraying him, reminding him every second not just of what he had lost, but of who he had been, an artist, a creator, a man defined by his hands. And now he was just the shell, the empty husk. When he was finally discharged, the return home was the true sentence. The studio, his former sanctuary, greeted him with a silent hostility. The smell of marble dust and clay, which once soothed him, now suffocated him, a perfume from a past life. His tools were exactly where he had left them, organized on wall panels, clean, sharp, ready. They stared back at him, mocking his uselessness. In the center of the warehouse, the sculpture he was finishing before the fire, covered by a sheet, looked like a body in a morgue. He didn't have the courage to pull back the cloth. He walked to his workbench, his heart hammering. With a trembling effort, he tried to pick up a simple stick of charcoal. His new limbs, clumsy and numb beneath the bandages, couldn't grasp it. The charcoal rolled and fell to the floor, breaking in two. The tiny sound echoed in the silence like a gunshot. That was the confirmation. He was an exile in his own kingdom. And it was there, in that limbo of powerlessness, that he found his new occupation, his new form of torture. Sitting in the gloom of the studio, he spent his days and nights with the phone in his hand, the blue glow of the screen his only son. He became an obsessed spectator of Savannah's life. He watched her flourish on his ashes. He saw the photos of her healing trip to a yoga retreat in Bali, the serene smile, the captions about forgiveness and new beginnings. He read the exclusive interview she gave to a celebrity magazine, where she spoke in detail about the trauma of the fire and how the experience made her a stronger, more focused woman. He watched her videos at charity events, her voice cracking as she spoke about the importance of rising up after a tragedy. Every post, every story, every smile was another shovel of dirt thrown on top of him. He read the comments, thousands of them, praising her strength, her beauty, her inspiration. He was witnessing in real time the solidification of her lie and the complete erasure of his truth. The world loved her for the story he gave her, and he didn't even exist in it. The humiliation was no longer an event. It was his daily bread, a force-feeding of his own non-existence. The studio gathered dust, the food that friends left at the door rotted. He wasted away in the darkness, a voluntary prisoner of a 6-inch screen until there was nothing left. Just a hollow man in a silent studio, haunted by the ghost of his hands and the certainty that he had become nothing. It's a silent, terrible pain, isn't it? Becoming a ghost in the life of the person you loved most. I want to ask you a question, and I ask you to answer with your heart. Have you ever felt completely invisible to someone for whom you sacrificed a part of yourself? Have you ever tasted the bitterness of seeing your greatest gestures of love not just ignored, but completely erased from the story? If that feeling of emptiness resonates with you in any way, if you understand what it's like to be turned into nothing, just comment, "I know," down below, just so I know you're here. For every person who feels this pain, there comes a moment when the darkness becomes so absolute that the slightest sliver of light seems like an impossible miracle. For Leo, sunk in his mausoleum of dust and memories, that light didn't arrive as an angel. It came in the form of a sharp, insistent knock on the metal door of the studio. He ignored it. The knocking continued, louder, stubborn. He shrank into his armchair, wishing he could disappear. Then the sound of an old lock being forced, and the door creaked open, flooding the space with the harsh afternoon light. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the brightness, was a woman he had never seen before. She wasn't young, perhaps in her late 50s, with graying hair tied in a loose bun and a face etched with lines that didn't seem to be from sadness, but from determination. She wore work pants, and her hands, which held a worn leather case, were strong, with gnarled knuckles. She was the opposite of Savannah. She was real. "Leo Vance?" she said, her voice firm, no nonsense. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. She walked in uninvited, her practical gaze sweeping over the chaos of the studio, the dust, the dirty dishes, and finally landing on him. "My name is Helen Carter. I'm a physical therapist. The hospital called me. You've missed all 12 of your scheduled appointments." She placed the case on the floor with a dull thud. "Looks like I found you." Leo didn't answer. He just stared at her with empty eyes, a passive hostility emanating from him. He wanted her to leave. Her presence, so full of life and purpose, was an offense to his misery. "I don't need you," he muttered, the first words he'd spoken in weeks. Helen gave a humorless half-smile. "I know you think that. You think it's all over because your tools are broken." She walked over to the sheet-covered sculpture and, without ceremony, yanked off the fabric. The marble figure, the personification of his anguish, emerged into the light. "Did you make this?" she asked, pointing. Leo nodded reluctantly. "Wrong," Helen said, turning to him. "You didn't. Your hands did. And now that they're gone, you think the artist went with them. How foolish!" He glared at her. Who was this woman to invade his grief with such arrogance? "You don't understand anything," he spat. "Of course I don't," she retorted, sitting on a wooden stool in front of him. "Let me tell you what I do understand. My father was a watchmaker, the best in the city. His hands were the most precise things I've ever seen. He could disassemble and reassemble tiny mechanisms with gears the size of a grain of sand, just by feel and a magnifying glass. It was his life, his identity. At 45, a degenerative disease left him blind. In 6 months, the darkness was total. She paused, her eyes locked on Leo's. "He spent a year just like you, a ghost in his own house, bitter, broken, saying his life was over. One day my mother, tired of watching him die slowly, threw a box with the parts of a broken watch into his lap and said, 'Your eyes died, not your hands. Figure it out.' He was furious. But then he started to touch the pieces, to feel them, to listen to them. He started using his ears, his touch, his memory. He learned to identify each tiny gear by its weight, its texture, the sound it made when it fell on the table. It took 2 years of frustration and failure, but one day I came home and heard a tick-tock. The watch was working. My father never saw the light of day again, Leo, but he fixed watches for another 30 years, until the day he died. And the work he did blind. It was more perfect than before because it was made with his soul, not his eyes." The silence in the studio was thick. Helen's words hung in the air, disarming Leo's anger, leaving something new in its place. She stood up and opened her case. From inside, she took out a large block of damp grey clay and placed it on the table beside him. "Your father taught you to sculpt. Mine taught me that what defines a craftsman isn't the tool he uses, but the indomitable will to create. Your hands don't obey you anymore. Fine, use your fists, your elbows, use the rage that's consuming you. Turn this disgusting grief of yours into something. Feel this," she said, slapping the clay. "It's alive. It's waiting for you, or you can just keep sitting there, rotting in this dust, feeling sorry for yourself. The choice is yours." She closed her case. "I'll be back on Monday, and I don't work with the dead." Helen turned and walked out, leaving the door open. Sunlight streamed in, illuminating the block of clay. Leo looked at it, then at his useless hands, and for the first time in months he felt something. It wasn't hope, it was fury. A pure, primitive fury that rose in his chest. Slowly, with an effort that felt like moving a mountain, he leaned forward. The act of leaning forward consumed all his remaining energy. For a long moment, Leo just stared at the grey block of clay. He didn't see an opportunity. He saw an insult, a reminder of his powerlessness. The rage Helen had awakened bubbled inside him, a poison with no escape. Then he did the only thing his body would allow. With a guttural roar, he lunged forward, striking the clay not with his hands, but with the bandaged mass of his forearm. He slammed it again and again, a blind, primitive fury taking over. He punched, shoved, and tore at the soft material with a violence he didn't know he possessed. It wasn't an act of creation, it was one of destruction. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with tears of rage. When he finally stopped, exhausted, panting, the clay was a misshapen, tortured mass, scarred with his pain. It was ugly, it was brutal, but for the first time in months, it was something he had made. When Helen returned on Monday, she found him asleep in the armchair next to the mutilated lump of clay. She didn't say a word. She just observed the scene, her practical gaze assessing the destruction. "Good," she said finally, and the sound of her voice woke him. "Anger is an excellent fuel, burns a lot of energy. Now let's learn how to turn it into real strength." And so the slow, brutal transformation began. Working with Helen was the opposite of compassion. It was military discipline. She forced him through exercises that felt medieval. He had to stretch the scar tissue of his hands to the edge of pain until he felt the skin would tear. He had to try to pick up small rubber balls that always fell, reminding him of his ineptitude. Sweat dripped from his brow. Frustration left him trembling, but Helen was implacable. "Again," she would order, her voice devoid of emotion. "Your brain has forgotten the road to your hands. We have to build a new one, and you don't build roads with pity. You build them with work." There were days the darkness returned with full force. One afternoon, after an hour of trying and failing to button his own shirt, he exploded. He hurled one of the rubber balls against the wall with all his strength. "It's useless!" he yelled at her, his voice choked with despair. "This is a joke. I'll never be able to hold a fork right, let alone a chisel. Why don't you just leave me alone in my misery?" Helen was unfazed. She just picked up the ball from the floor and placed it in front of him. "My father said that too. Said he'd rather die than live in a world without light. But he didn't die. He learned to use the darkness. You're not special, Leo. Your pain isn't unique. The only thing that separates you from anyone else is what you're going to do with it. Now, pick up the ball. Again." And, defeated by her stubbornness, he obeyed. The turning point didn't come from a success in physical therapy. It came from a moment of pure clarity in the midst of despair. One sleepless night, he was sitting in his studio, staring at his tools hanging on the wall. They looked like relics from a lost civilization. He would never hold them the same way again. The truth hit him with brutal simplicity. He was trying to fix his hands, to use his old tools. That was the wrong path. He needed to create new tools for the hands he had now. The idea electrified him. For the first time, it wasn't a memory of the past moving him, but a possibility for the future. With difficulty, he taped a pencil to his hand and began to sketch in a notebook. His lines were childish, shaky, but the mind behind them was that of a master craftsman. He designed leather supports, metal braces, systems of straps and buckles that could firmly attach a chisel or a file to his forearm, turning his entire arm into the tool. He used his knowledge of weight, balance, and physics to design something that would give him back his power. He wasn't healing. He was reinventing himself. It took weeks. He found an old saddle maker and a metal worker, craftsmen like him, who looked at his drawings not with pity, but with professional respect. They helped him build the prototypes. And then came the day of the test. He strapped the first brace to his right arm, a structure of leather and steel with a small chisel firmly attached to the end. It was heavy, clumsy. He approached a block of soapstone, his heart pounding. He took a deep breath, moving not his hand but his shoulder, his torso, using his whole body's weight. The chisel touched the stone. Tack. A small white fragment chipped away. He looked at the mark. An imperfect line, but a line, a mark made by him. Here, now. It wasn't the graceful fluidity of before, but it was control. It was creation. In that instant, in the silence of his studio, the sound of his new work began. A different rhythm, slower, heavier. The sound of a man who was no longer trying to recover what he'd lost, but building something new with what he had left. The years that followed Helen's arrival were not of silence, but of a new kind of sound. The slow, heavy rhythm of Leo's adapted chisel became the soundtrack of his resurrection. He didn't recover the dexterity of his old hands. Instead, he forged a new language. The frustration with the slowness of working in stone pushed him toward a new medium. He, a man of matter, of dust and weight, discovered light. With the help of Helen, who sold her father's gold watch to fund Leo's first powerful computer, he plunged into the world of 3D modeling. He spent sleepless nights learning, failing, adapting software with accessibility devices he created himself. He could no longer feel the stone, so he learned to feel the digital form, the virtual space, the texture of pixels. And he discovered projection mapping, the ability to use the world's architecture as his canvas. He became a sculptor of light, an artist whose work was as massive as a building and as ephemeral as an instant. He adopted a pseudonym, Ghost. It was perfect. He had been a ghost in his own story, and now he would be one in the city. His works began to appear without warning. One night, the face of an old woman, every wrinkle sculpted in light, would appear on the facade of an abandoned factory, crying neon tears that ran down the wall. The next, a pair of giant skeletal hands would try to grasp the structure of a bridge, their fingers of light dissolving in the wind. They were illegal, powerful, and hauntingly beautiful interventions. The city started talking. Who was Ghost? The media dubbed him the Architect of Light. His appearances became viral events, nighttime hunts for photographers and onlookers, all wanting to witness the next light sculpture. The irony was brutal. Leo, who had been made invisible, was now the most talked-about anonymous artist in the country. The fame of Ghost grew so much that what was subversive became desired. The city, in a cultural marketing move, made a public invitation, asking the mysterious artist to create an official installation for the city's anniversary. After a negotiation conducted by Helen through anonymous emails, he accepted. The event was named Fragments, a one-night-only exhibition in the main square, using the facade of the imposing Municipal Theatre, a neoclassical stone building, as its canvas. The city was in a frenzy. The promise of a monumental work from the most enigmatic artist of the moment was irresistible. The news, of course, reached Savannah Cole. Her career, in the years that had passed, had exploded. She was no longer just an influencer. She was a brand. She had her own online talk show, a line of beauty products, and a team that managed every second of her perfectly curated life. She lived in a glass penthouse overlooking the city, a space as white and impersonal as a luxury hospital room. When her assistant presented the brief on the Fragments event, she barely looked up from her phone. Ghost, the light artist. Yeah, I know. Viral, mysterious, exclusive, she smiled at her reflection. This is gold. The audience will eat it up. Get the crew ready. I want the best camera. We're going live. It'll be the highest engagement of the quarter. In her mind, Leo Vance no longer existed. He was a step she had stood on and forgotten, a chapter of her biography she had successfully edited and deleted. On the night of the event, the square was impassable. A crowd of thousands jostled for space, their faces turned up in anticipation toward the theater's stone facade. Savannah was in her element, a swan gliding through the chaos. With a microphone in hand and a cameraman in tow, she was broadcasting live. Hey, my loves! The energy here is just indescribable. The entire city has stopped to see the magic of Ghost happen. A few blocks away, in a hotel room with a window open to the square, Leo watched everything on a series of monitors. He was calm, his fingers dancing over the control console, the leather braces on his arms seeming like a natural extension of his body. Helen was beside him, holding a cup of tea, a serene smile on her face. The predator and the prey were on the same board, but only one of them knew the rules of the game. At 9 o'clock sharp, the lights in the square went out. A collective "Oh" rose from the crowd. Silence fell, and then light. A single white beam hit the center of the theater and expanded, covering the stone facade with geometric shapes that danced in a hypnotic choreography. It was beautiful, the crowd sighed. Savannah narrated, ecstatic. It's pure visual poetry, a symphony of light. Slowly the shapes began to coalesce. They took the form of two hands, strong and detailed, molding a block of luminous matter. The crowd went silent. The hands worked, and then the face of a stunning woman appeared, looking at the hands with adoration. And then the light shifted. It became orange, red, chaotic. Flames of light licked the stone. A beam of light fell. The hands lunged at it, pushing. The crowd held its breath. The hands of light began to burn, to disintegrate, to shatter into thousands of pixels, into fragments. In the square, the silence was absolute. Savannah stopped talking. Her professional smile froze, the blood draining from her face. The final projection appeared, devastating in its simplicity, the image of two bandaged hands, recreated in light, holding a piece of charcoal that drew a trembling line. The line of life. Then, beneath the image, crisp white letters were carved into the stone by the light. A work by Leo Vance. His name, not ghosts. The name of the man she had tried to erase. The projection dissolved, plunging the facade into darkness. But the truth was now burned into the memory of everyone present. When the last image of light faded from the theater's stone facade, the silence that fell over the square was different from any other. It wasn't a silence of admiration. It was heavy, dense, charged with a brutal revelation. Thousands of people who minutes before were united in an experience of beauty were now isolated in their own thoughts, trying to process the story they had just witnessed without a single word. That silence lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity, and then it was broken. Not by applause, but by a low murmur that started at the front and spread like a wave through the crowd. Whispers. Leo Vance? Did he say? Leo? The story of the fire? I remember, but it wasn't like that. The cell phones, which had been raised to record the art, now tilted down, thumbs typing furiously. Sculptor Leo Vance, gallery fire. Savannah Cole, fiancé sculptor. The truth, which had been projected onto the building, was now being hunted, verified, and confirmed in the palm of every spectator's hand. The art had made the accusation. Technology was delivering the verdict. And at the center of it all, Savannah. Her universe imploded live for an audience of millions. The professional smile, frozen on her face, began to tremble at the corners. Her cameraman, a young freelancer, instinctively lowered the camera and whispered in a panic, "Savannah, what do I do? We're live." But she didn't hear him. Her eyes were glued to her own phone screen, which she held with a trembling hand. She was watching her own ruin in real time. The comment feed on her live stream, which seconds before had been a cascade of hearts, praise, and fire emojis, had transformed into a digital tribunal, a mass lynching. The words appeared faster than she could read, each one a stone thrown at the fragile glass structure of her life. Monster! Cancelled! I can't believe I cried for you. She built her entire career on his sacrifice. Leo, I found the old article. Artist loses hands, saving fiancé. Oh my God, it's real. What kind of person does that? Trash. Career over. She tried to speak, to open her mouth, to say something, to defend herself, to use one of her canned phrases about narratives and perspectives, but no words came out. A pathetic, choked sound was all she could manage. Her mind, so adept at creating content, at projecting an image, was short-circuiting. There was no filter for this. There was no good angle. The truth was an ugly, no-makeup close-up, and the camera was on. The shockwave expanded beyond the square with the speed of light. In newsroom offices, editors were yelling orders. The articles that were ready to be published, with headlines like "Ghost Enchants City with Masterpiece of Light," were deleted. In their place, new, cruel, and sensational headlines were being written in a frenzy, the shocking truth behind the ghost artist. Savannah Cole, the empire built on a lie. In advertising agency offices, Saturday night was interrupted by frantic phone calls. Brand managers who had invested millions in Savannah's resilient and inspiring image were now scrambling to distance themselves from the disaster. Pull the campaign now. Draft a press release. Morality clause. "We're terminating the contract." The same brands that celebrated her as an icon of overcoming now treated her like toxic waste. Her friends in the industry, other influencers and celebrities who posed with her at events, began the silent purge, the mass unfollowing, the old photos deleted, messages ignored. In less than an hour, the life she had spent years meticulously building was dismantled with a few clicks. She had become radioactive. While the digital world burned, a few blocks away in the hotel room, the atmosphere was one of profound calm. Leo watched his final projection fade and, with a slow, deliberate movement, shut down the main equipment. The hum of the computers ceased. Silence filled the room. He didn't open a new window to check Savannah's feed or the news. He didn't care. The goal had never been revenge, but liberation. To tell his own story, in his own voice, even if that voice was made of light and silence. He needed the world to know, not so they would hate her, but so he could finally stop hating himself. So the ghost that haunted him could finally have a name. Helen, who had been silent the whole time, simply placed a firm hand on his shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of congratulations, but of acknowledgement. The end of a journey. Leo turned away from the electronic paraphernalia and walked to the window. He looked down at the square, at the agitated crowd, and then at the dark facade of the theatre. His canvas was blank again. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs without the weight of a secret, without the taste of injustice. He didn't smile. The feeling wasn't happiness. It was peace. A vast, empty, and absolute peace. He was free. The next morning, the digital world was still on fire. Savannah's name was the top trending topic, a synonym for fraud and cruelty. Headlines screamed her condemnation, brands published notes of repudiation, and her image, once ubiquitous, was systematically erased from campaigns and websites. She was, ironically, being deleted. But in Leo's studio, where he and Helen had returned before dawn, an almost sacred peace reigned. The soft morning light streamed through the skylight, and the dust, which for so long had seemed like the ash of his dead life, now danced in the air like particles of gold, of possibility. Helen was reading the news on a tablet, her expression neutral. "It's over for her," she said simply, without looking up. Leo, who was cleaning one of his new tools with a cloth, showed no reaction. There wasn't a shred of triumph in his chest, no dark satisfaction in knowing of her ruin. The truth was, he barely thought about her. Thinking of her was like trying to remember an old fever. You remember it hurt, that it was terrible, but you can no longer feel the heat on your skin, the obsession, the pain, the hatred. It had all been spent in the creation of the night before. He had projected his suffering out of himself, and now the space it had occupied was clean, empty. "How do you feel?" Helen asked, finally looking at him. Leo stopped what he was doing and pondered the question. He looked at his own hands, at the scars that mapped his history, at the leather and steel braces resting on the workbench. "Empty," he replied, his voice calm. "But it's not a bad empty. It's like a clean room. It's space." He walked to the window, watching the city's life begin again. "For years, I believed that I was the artist, but that the art was in my hands. When I lost them, I believed her sentence, the world's sentence. I believed I was a broken vessel, a defective tool that no longer served its purpose. I spent all that time grieving not for myself, but for my hands, as if they were a separate entity." He turned to Helen, a deep understanding clearing his eyes. "What you made me understand, Helen, what your father understood, is that the tool is just a channel, a method. The source of creation isn't in your fingertips. It's here," he said, touching his temple and then his chest. "The source is memory, it's pain. It's the stubborn will to turn chaos into some kind of order, even if it's the order of a single line on a stone. The fire didn't destroy the artist. It destroyed my old method, my comfort. It forced me to dig deeper, to find a new voice in a place where I thought only silence existed." He realized then the final lesson of his journey. Savannah's strength came from a carefully constructed image, a fortress of appearances. It was imposing, but hollow, and it took only a single stone of truth for it all to crumble. His own strength, he now understood, was born from the exact opposite. It was born from his weakness, from his brokenness, from his most honest pain. He didn't win by being strong. He won by having the courage to be vulnerable, to turn his ugliest wound into his truest work of art. With that thought, he walked to the dustiest corner of the studio, where the sheet-covered sculpture still waited. The work he had created for the opening, the symbol of his old anguish. For years, he had avoided that corner as if it were radioactive. Now, without hesitation, he grabbed a corner of the sheet and pulled. The marble figure emerged, still contorted in its beautiful agony. He looked at it for a long time, not with pain, but with a serene distance, like someone looking at an old photograph of himself. That man, that suffering, it was no longer him. With a slow gesture, he reached out and touched the statue's cold face with the scarred part of his hand. It was a touch of farewell, a goodbye not to the pain, but to the version of himself who had allowed it to define him. The cycle was closed. The dust, both from the scandal and from Leo's studio, settled with time, revealing a new landscape, redrawn by the force of truth. Savannah Cole vanished, not dramatically with one last attempt to defend herself, but in a much more definitive way. She dissolved. Her digital empire, built on the fragile foundation of image, couldn't withstand the earthquake. The brands abandoned her, the followers became detractors, and her name became an anecdote, a cautionary tale whispered in the digital world's back alleys about the dangers of hollow fame. There were rumors she moved to a distant country, changed her name, that she lived a quiet, anonymous life, far from any camera. No one knew for sure. And, in time, no one cared anymore. For someone who lived for attention, irrelevance was the most fitting sentence. She wasn't cancelled, she was forgotten. Leo Vance, on the other hand, became unforgettable. But he handled the fame that followed the Fragments event on his own terms. He refused the magazine covers, the sensationalist interviews, the offers to turn his story into a movie. He wasn't interested in being a symbol of overcoming or a celebrity. The artist who had been exposed to the world no longer wanted to be the center of attention. He continued to create, accepting only commissions that resonated with his soul. Public memorials, installations in hospitals, works that spoke of memory, resilience, and the beauty found in imperfection. With the money and recognition he gained, he fulfilled his old desire, but in a way the old Leo could never have imagined. He didn't build a house for a love, he built a home for art. The Fragments Foundation was born in an old warehouse complex he bought and renovated. It was a fully accessible art creation center designed from the ground up for artists with physical disabilities. The workbenches had adjustable heights, the doors were wide, and the tools were an impressive collection of adaptive devices, many designed by Leo himself. The place became a haven, a meeting point for creators who, like him, had been told by the world they could no longer create. There they could. On a sunny afternoon, years later, the Foundation's main studio was bathed in light. The sound was no longer that of a single artist working in solitude, but a symphony of activity. The buzz of an adapted saw, the soft sound of paintbrushes, laughter. Leo wasn't on a pedestal. He was sitting next to a young woman in a wheelchair who was looking frustrated at the screen in front of her. "I can't get the line I want," she said, disappointed. "My prosthetic arm doesn't have that sensitivity." Leo said nothing. He just picked up a leather support and, with the patience of a monk, adjusted the straps on her arm, changing the angle of the brush by millimeters. "Don't try to control it with your wrist," he said, his voice calm. "Feel the movement coming from your shoulder. Use your body's weight. Let the intention guide the tool, not the other way around." The young woman tried again. A fluid, strong, colorful line appeared on the screen. She gasped, looking at her own creation with wonderful astonishment. Leo watched her face light up, and a genuine, peaceful smile appeared on his own lips. In a corner, Helen sipped a cup of tea, observing the scene. Her eyes met Leo's, and they shared a moment of silent understanding. His happiness was no longer in the work he created, but in the possibility he opened up for others. The scars on his hands were still there, visible, but they no longer ached. They were just part of the texture of who he had become. A man who learned that true art isn't about shaping stone or light, but about helping another soul find its own way to shine. Leo's story teaches us that our tools can break, but our purpose doesn't have to. If this journey of a man who was erased to a creator who illuminated the world moved you in any way, your like is the most powerful sign that it's worth telling stories about the strength of the human spirit. And I really want to know where your strength comes from. Let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Seriously, I read them all with so much care and make a point to reply. If you believe in the power of stories like this one, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Every new subscription gives me the fuel and the certainty to continue this journey. I'm really counting on your help. Don't go just yet. Choose one of the 2 stories I've left on the screen for you to watch next. I'll see you in the next video.